My name's Catherine Bailey, and I'm Director of Communications, Policy and Partnerships at the Ethical Data Initiative, and I will be your moderator for today's session. The Ethical Data Discussion Series explores pressing ethical questions inherent in digital technology, data collection and data-driven research, highlighting the need for training digital practitioners in the ethics of data protection, use and reuse. And as we know, we are living in a digitally transformed society. And while the digital revolution has transformed the way we live, solving many issues and leading to better decision-making, it's also given rise to numerous questions and challenges, which of course affect everyone. Africa certainly has not been left behind in this data revolution, which affects and benefits all of us, though perhaps not all in the same way. But we do need to be aware of how our data is being used and stored, what our responsibilities are, and how legislation affects us. So to this end, we've begun the Data Ethics and Data Science Education campaign to advocate for the inclusion of data ethics in all data science and research-based higher education courses to train the next generation of data research professionals about their legal and ethical responsibilities surrounding the use, reuse, and sharing of data. We'll send out more information, by the way, about the campaign, including how you can get involved, and we'll send that to all participants after the webinar. Today, we will be delving into questions of data ethics and human rights in the platform economy. So before we get started, I'd like to do a little housekeeping. And if anybody disagrees with the ground rules, then please feel free to let us know for future webinars, or to decide perhaps not to partake in the webinar, but we do hope that you stay with us for the whole discussion. This event's being live streamed and recorded, as we've just mentioned, and it will be available on YouTube and on AAU TV. And for those of you who are not familiar already with the Association of African Universities, they do have a TV network that was established in 2018 to deliver news and information on important higher education related issues on the continent. So this webinar will be streamed in 22 countries. And will be streamed across the TV network. So just to make you aware of that. To let you know as well, we will be dropping a link to a questionnaire in the chat box towards the end of the session today, which we'll also send out by email to everybody registered for this event. This is to gather feedback and help us understand audience priorities, and it should only take 2 to 3 minutes to fill in. I'm going to mention this again at the end of the webinar, but we're going to be asking you for your feedback on the discussion today, and we hope that you're able to participate in that. We would also ask that you please use the chat function for any discussion during the event. Please keep your microphones muted and respect the panelists, and please don't interrupt the speakers or the conversation that's going on. But do feel free to use that chat box to add to the debate, make your opinions known, and put forward questions to the panel. We'll endeavour to ask as many of those questions as we can during the event. So it just remains for me to let you know about the structure of the webinar today. But before I do that, then Juliet Thondlana, who has been instrumental in the campaign and in our partnership, who is Chair of International Development and Education at UNESCO, and who is Professor of International Development and Education at the University of Nottingham. We're very pleased to have her here with us today, and she would like to give a little introduction into the partnership and into our plans and aims with that. Juliet, if you're ready.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I think you have already given a brilliant introduction. I would only add a few words. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, the Association of African Universities, in partnership with the University of Nottingham and the Ethical Data Initiative, have launched a groundbreaking campaign for the inclusion of data ethics in data science education on a global scale. The campaign is important for protecting humanity in the digital economy, including artificial intelligence, big data, the Internet of Things, and social media. Ladies and gentlemen, news is filtering through various media houses around the world as we speak that global cyber attacks have hit multiple agencies, pensions, hospitals, and schools across the world, exposing numerous human data to exploitation by criminal elements. At the same time, we have also noted an upsurge in calls by UNESCO for nations to come together on issues relating to data ethics and data science. More recently, and in response to this call, the United Kingdom government have announced that they are positioning the UK to take a lead in this initiative. We are therefore more convinced than ever of the urgency of this data ethics campaign and are proud that the AAU and Africa are leading these crucial conversations. The campaign has earnestly begun with a series of informative webinars and panel discussions lined up to be aired on AAU TV. Today's webinar is the second one. This initiative aligns with UNESCO's focus on human rights economy, the right to science, academic freedom, and international scientific cooperation. As Africa has been declared a UNESCO global priority, this campaign is a significant contribution of the AAU to UNESCO's operational strategy for Africa. We thank you for coming and looking forward to a very productive conversation today. Back to you, Catherine.
Thank you, Juliet. Thank you for that wonderful introduction there. So if everybody's happy, then we will dive into today's topic. Like I've said, please keep those microphones off and respect the discussion that's going on today. But please make the most of those chat functions and the little sort of stickers and emotions as well. If you would like to use those to show us what you're thinking or put some comments in the chat or questions for the panelists, then please do that. So our panel of experts today will be looking at our discussion through the lens of the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, discussing what's already been done to identify and mitigate potential harms and what more can be done. Signed at the UN General Assembly in Paris in 1948, these rights are recognised in municipal and international law. The declaration contains 30 articles outlining the 30 internationally accepted basic human rights, such as all humans being free and equal, the right to equality before the law, the right to privacy, the right to own property, the freedom of opinion and expression, for example, the right to assemble, the right to democracy, the right to work, including equal pay for equal work, and the right to education. And we're absolutely delighted to have such a broad range of expertise among our panel today to discuss questions such as the potential impact of AI on human rights, what we can do to protect marginalised and vulnerable groups, whether perhaps it's time now for data ethics to become an integral part of the education curriculum in schools and universities. So without further ado, I am excited to welcome our panelists today. So in no particular order, we have Dr. Hudson Kwandai, who is the Director of Academic and Institutional Audits at the Zimbabwe Council for Higher Education. He has a background in public policy. Dr. Kwandai lectures at the University of Zimbabwe and coordinates the Public Sector Management and Policy Master's Degree Programme at the Africa University. He's published widely in the areas of public policy analysis, leadership and governance. Dr. Admark Moyo is with us today. He is a senior lecturer in children's rights and family law at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. Dr. Moyo has advised governments and UN agencies on governance, human rights and children's rights in Africa, and his publications have been cited and used by national courts and authorities, including the South African Constitutional Court. Dr. Judith Rauhofer, we're delighted to have her with us, is a senior lecturer in IT law at the University of Edinburgh. Her research interests include all areas of data protection, online privacy, data justice, electronic surveillance and technology law. She advised the government of Namibia on its plans for the Namibian Data Protection Bill. She's also the co-author of the Commonwealth Model Provisions on Data Protection, And last but not least, Selemani Kinyanyu is an expert in law and international development with a broad range of Africa-focused experience. He served as an advisor on human rights in the African Union. Excuse me one second. He served as an advisor on human rights in the African Union, the East African Community, USAID, and German Department for International Cooperation, GIZ, among others. He's currently the Government Affairs lead for Africa at Microsoft, where he shapes Microsoft's policy agenda. Excuse me. There we go. So we will delve now into the questions and give my voice a little bit of a rest and hear from our panelists. So our first question for today, with the rise of the platform economy, what would our panelists say are the main human rights issues in the digital age and why? So I would like to go, please, to Selemani Kinyon, you to start us off, if you're ready.
Thank you, Catherine, and good day to everyone. And just to say, I think thanks to the organizers for putting this together. I think it's a really relevant conversation, especially given the time we are in now, really at an inflection point in the technology ecosystem. And these conversations, I think, are really important in terms of spurring greater debate and consensus in terms of how we as societies move together during this time. So, what do I think are some of the main reflections in terms of the intersection between the platform economy and human rights? And just to say, I'm speaking in my individual capacity today. I think, in particular reference to Africa, but also globally, inclusion, I think, is very relevant. And here speaking to concepts or norms around equality and inclusivity. And when we think about, the pace at which technology is advancing in our society, we also realize that there are many people who are left behind by not being included, and creating this, concept or notion of the digital divide. That's exceptionally relevant to, places like Africa, where individuals are then not able to access the technology and technology tools and platforms that will enable them to lead meaningful lives, whether it's education, healthcare, etc. And then this, further exacerbates existing inequalities. So I think that's definitely, one of the first or most important issues we need to think about if we want to create a society where everybody moves forward. And then I think the second thing, I'm sure we'll discuss this in more detail, is around privacy. The more that data is utilized by governments, corporations, and various bodies, the more that this data attracts commercial value. And as it attracts commercial value, many people are not sure where their data goes, how it's managed, what rights they have over their data, but also what rights they have to, for example, recall their data or have that data deleted if it's been stored. And so these issues, I think, are going to gain more and more attention as we move towards an increasingly digitally integrated world. I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Selemani. That gives us a really interesting insight and a really good basis to start from. It seems that Judith has had to step away for a while due to technical issues. So is Dr. Moyo with us yet?
Hi, Catherine. Thanks. And greetings from a very chilly Cape Town. I'm here in Stellenbosch. I want to talk about this issue from a children's rights perspective. And there are so many problems that I can't get into given the limited time that we have. So I'll just pick about three issues when we talk about children's rights in the platform economy. I think we have seen in the past 30 or so years, a growth of digital platforms, particularly photo and video sharing platforms. So let's take, for example, Instagram and YouTube, and the kind of following they generate, and how children, basically parents share videos where children are doing a lot of stuff. And the most interesting thing, I think, is that this has generated business opportunities for children as young as 6 or 7, where they advertise on behalf of very big tech companies that I think also harvest a lot of information that is then stored by these companies and can be used later at any time. But I think the most important thing here is whether that should be characterized as work or as play. And parents would want to tell us that it is really play. And play, of course, even in the digital environment, enables children to develop, to acquire new skills, to develop their social networks, and also even computer literacy and all that. But the challenge, I think, is that we have seen a lot of what I would call economic exploitation emerging on online platforms. And this is not just done by tech companies, it's also done by parents. I'll just give you 1 or 2 examples. So, for example, in 2016, we know one child called Rian, who made a fortune of about 11 million USD then, and had about 8 billion followers or viewers on YouTube, according to Forbes. And his income by 2022 had grown to exponentially to about 35 million USD. It's good if we can have parents that can manage this fortune, but also sometimes you do that in your early years, and then the money disappears somewhere as you grow up. So there are issues there, and of course we then have to also contrast whether that, earning a lot of money like that, which is good, you build a future, you build a career. But there are instances where stories don't unfold so well as the child grows up, and this compromises the child's right to develop and have an open future, especially where the funds are then misused after all that economic exploitation. Then the second one, which I will just maybe explain a bit in the next 30 seconds, because my brother has already talked about, is the harvesting of children's information online. Whether this is done in the context of playing games, or whether this is done in the context of children just creating digital footprints that they are not aware may become issues later on. And the third thing, I think, particularly in this part of the continent, is that many parents do not appear to be very aware of how to control or guide their children online. And in most cases, especially with adolescents, it is actually the adolescents that guide parents on how they should interact in the online environment, thereby exposing them to so many dangers online that I can't go into now due to time. The third one, I think, is video gaming, online video gaming, and issues of digital health and all that. And some of the games actually prompt you to buy lives, to move to the next stage. For children that have access to accounts, these games can become addictive and expensive, And in some contexts, you buy what are called loot boxes and all that. So there are ethical issues there that I think governments in Africa have not grappled with at the moment to ensure that our children are safe online. And I have to say this, and this is my last statement. I have to say this, that for most countries in Africa, issues relating to advances in technology do not really arise. We're just reproducing what is happening in the global north. Mainly, we don't see a lot of inventions. So a lot of abuses take place on online platforms that are already there. And I think in this part of the world, very few governments are ready to raise these ethical issues because, well, they might not be aware of them, or they actually produce streams of income that governments may want to rely on in doing development work. So let me, for now, stop there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moyo, for your intervention there. And it's really interesting to have that other perspective, thinking about children and how they are directly actually affected by the digital revolution and by what is happening at the moment. I've also noticed we're very pleased to have with us Dr. Olusola Oyewole, who is the director of the Association of African Universities. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I would also like to ask whether our final panelist, Dr. Kwandai, has managed to make it. Whether he has anything to add on that question before we move on to the next.
Yes, I managed, and apologies, I had just technical challenges, just a few minutes into the webinar. Otherwise, thank you very much. I've just joined. Thank you.
Welcome. Do you have anything to add on the first question that we asked today? So we were talking about the rise of the platform economy and what you would see as the main human rights issues and why.
In fact, I've just joined, so I think for now, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
That's completely understandable. I've also been told that Judith Rauhofer, our ICT legal expert, has managed to rejoin the event. Judith, if you're there, would you have anything to add on the first question?
Actually, Catherine, I have not. I'm still currently sitting outside. We have a fire alarm for everyone. Sorry.
Okay. No, it's no problem. So she's been very helpful and has just let me know, my colleague, that you may be online, but we will come back to you later. Thank you very much. So on to our second question. How are basic human rights as defined by the UN Declaration on Human Rights embedded into current data legislation? And is there more to do in this area? Dr. Kwandai, I believe that you would like to weigh in on this question.
Come again?
So I believe that you have a response to give us to this question. So how are basic human rights as defined by the UN Declaration on Human Rights embedded into data legislation? And is there more to do in this area?
Basically, I think there is quite a lot. If we look at the legislation to do with data protection, etc., it shows that a lot of human rights have to be protected. We look at the various human rights issues which have to be looked at, the lawfulness, the fairness, transparency, accuracy, etc. So human rights for individuals, human rights for others, I think is very, very important in terms of legislation. Otherwise, my main focus will be looking at human data ethics and data law into the curriculum. And of course, looking at the marginalized. Those are the areas which I'll pay more attention to. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Selemani, do you have anything to add to this question?
Thanks. I think when looking at most sort of data protection legislation, we see the amplification of three types or three categories of rights. So obviously, first, the right to expression, or the right for an individual to express themselves, and the right to freely express their conscience is something that data protection legislation protects. Sometimes, depending on country to country, some legislation can be restrictive of this, but generally, most legislation and most regional frameworks that we have, whether at the European Union or at the African Union, generally enforce this right. The second is the right to privacy. Again, data protection legislation is about protecting individuals' rights to privacy. So how that data can be accessed, what can be done with it, and the extent, the reaches of the rights, the various rights of data subjects and data holders is also discussed. And then again, increasingly, especially with newer data protection legislation, we see a broad category of rights around non-discrimination. So ensuring that individuals or different forms of data are treated to the same standard. Again, different types of legislation could have some gaps when it comes to discrimination. Some forms of data are treated at higher categories, but again, this is subject to countries' individual specifications. But data protection legislation generally, in my opinion, incorporates those three tiers of rights. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that precision. Would any of our other panelists like to add anything on how human rights are already embedded into data legislation and what more could perhaps be done around that? If not, we'll continue to the next question. So our third question for today is, what are the risks of not including vulnerable or marginalised groups in data sets? And how can we ensure that groups at risk of discrimination, for example, are properly represented? And I believe Dr. Moyo might be the person to kick us off here.
Catherine, the question again?
So what are the risks of not including vulnerable or marginalised groups in data sets? And how can we ensure that groups at risk of discrimination are properly represented? So, for example, that their views are not taken into consideration, or they're not taken into consideration in decision making.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. I think, the way in which technologies are developed, I think there is already a concern that there isn't much inclusion, for example, of persons with disabilities. So the technologies that we see do not really incorporate the interests of many marginalized groups, but also even the way in which the technologies are developed, they revolve around I think Western value systems, and in this part of the world may not actually mirror what is happening on the ground, especially in contexts where you're talking about the importance of group rights and how most of even the talk about human rights revolves around the individual. And when we approach rights in the digital sphere, we really focus on the individuals. But let me just revert back to children, really, and try to focus on that the problem with most of the developments we are seeing in the technological age is that the safeguarding mechanisms that are there to protect children online are not really adequate. So let's take video gaming, for example. You would realize that most of the games have age limits. So when a child tries to log in or to sign up, there is just a prompt that says, this game is meant, for example, for persons who are 13 and above. And if the child just confirms that, well, I'm 13 or I'm 17, we don't have enough mechanisms to actually verify that what the child is saying is true. So you have children getting involved in activities that are not appropriate to their age. Yet, if you look at the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is a UN treaty, and even the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, one of the most important principles is that whatever happens to a child online must be both age appropriate, but also be consistent with the evolving capacities of the child. And the sad thing, as I said, is that the relationship in our context between parents and children online is actually the other way. It is most of the parents that have to learn and have digital literacy and be able to guide children. Children are a bit ahead of the parents, so you have a lot of activities going on online. I mean, I have entered into internet caves and have seen kids as young as 7 watching, for example, pornography. And when they go to public caves, there is no one really to watch there. The person owning the cave is interested in the money, and the child is on their own. So there are issues there, I think.
Safeguarding is definitely
yes.
Safeguarding is definitely a big issue, and kind of being able to online and in the digital context is really, really difficult as well. But I'm wondering if we could delve a little bit deeper into your ideas around marginal groups, because I know that you've worked with a lot of communities with people with disabilities, for example. And what do you think would be the main issues really of data not being collected or represented in the right way in order to sort of make decisions around people with disabilities, or make decisions for the whole population, including these marginalized groups?
I think one of the main issues is urgency. So the decisions that you will make at the top level really reflect the understanding of people in positions of power, privilege, and from the values of the middle class way up. So you don't get to understand the issues that are happening in marginalized communities because the people are not represented. So the decision making becomes top down instead of being informed by what is happening on the ground. So I think I would end there and perhaps hope that maybe one panelist may also jump in and say something.
Thank you. That gives us a really good perspective, because I know that you've done a lot of work there around marginalised groups, particularly people with disabilities.
Could I also come in? Could I also come in?
Absolutely. Please.
Thank you very much. There is quite a lot which could happen in terms of risks if people who are marginalized, whose data is not included. First of all, we look at the likelihood of relying on averages. And averages have a tendency to conceal poverty, conceals discrimination, injustice, even oppression. So if we leave out the marginalized, we tend to use averages. For example, income. You find that, say, income is 200 US per month, when others have got millions and others have got zero. So that means we won't do much to try to improve that. There's also the issue of bias and discrimination. that if we don't include these people, there will be bias perpetuated in the system because the people are marginalized. Also, there will be less accountability. You find that if the poor are left out, government will be less accountable in terms of improving their lives. There will be invisibility of these people. You remember Caroline Perez wrote a book on the invisibility of women. So if data is not collected, you find that we lose quite a lot. Even advocacy. We want to improve the lives of the marginalized, the lives of the poor. Yet if we don't have data, which should help us for advocacy, we are going to have serious challenges. And also, of course, policy making. It means we need data-driven policy. We need data-driven or evidence-based policy making. Without that data for the poor, we are going to leave them. And inequalities, discrimination is going to continue. And finally, you say that we are going to have a vicious cycle of poverty, whereby the poor, they are not represented, their poverty is likely to continue. Yet generally, we would want virtuous, whereby everyone benefits. We get better and better. So there's quite a lot. If we don't include these people, their human rights will be trampled upon. Probably I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you for that perspective. That really kind of highlights the main issues that are really endemic in not collecting sufficient data, and certainly in not including minority groups within those data sets. I don't know if Judith, I can see that you've rejoined us. Thank you very much. Would you have anything to say on the risks of not including vulnerable or marginalized groups in data sets?
I do actually, yeah, and apologies for having to run out. It was just got very, very loud as well. Yeah, I do. And I think I would like to, I appreciate everything that, my esteemed colleague has said, but I would also, I think, like to sound of a note of caution from the experience that we've had in Europe, where really one of the main problems was not underrepresentation of marginalized communities in the data, but overrepresentation. And I think if we understand data as power, which it, ultimately is and is going to be, then the more anyone knows about you, the more power they also have with regard to regulating your life. And we have had some very severe cases where this has backfired for disabled communities, for marginalized communities, for people living in poverty. So, for instance, in the Netherlands a few years ago, a benefit system was installed, which basically used all available data. And you have to be aware that, of course, there is a lot more data available to the state about poor people or people living in poverty or people living with disabilities, because they are much more reliant on government benefits. So there was an awful lot of data about these people in the databases, these communities. And what then happened was that they used an AI system to try and determine who was likely to commit benefit fraud. And it very quickly materialized that people living with disabilities were flagged up disproportionately often. And they actually brought this before the courts. And because of the data protection legislation we have in Europe, that was actually picked up, and that sort of benefit system, wasn't allowed to be used in this context. But I would quite like to raise, a note of caution that as much as it is important to have information about also marginalized communities, it is then doubly important to make sure that there are, restrictive data protection regulations that deal with how this data can be processed, because once the data is there, it can be used for all sorts of purposes, and those purposes may not always benefit marginalized communities. And in contrast, history has essentially shown, or experience has shown, that often they are not.
Thank you very much, Judith. That's a really interesting perspective, because, of course, where there's underrepresentation, we don't often think of overrepresentation necessarily being an issue. But you've really shown us how that can definitely affect decision making, how that can affect processes. We have an audience question that's come in that I would like to share with you all from Michael Strange. Regarding involving marginalised groups, Michael says, where in the tech process could they be best involved? So is it just through providing better data or really us gathering better data from them? Or can we see ways of involving marginalised groups in, for example, tech development or policy reform? Judith, would you perhaps like to weigh in on that? Or?
Yeah, I can. I think, there are a number of different parts in the process where marginalized communities should be involved. It is always going to be a big policy decision, to put the money behind it, because that's ultimately what it is, unless you want to make it an extractive process. I think, there is engagement with grassroots organizations in, the legislative process when sort of legislation, or even when big procurement projects are going to be, carried out, that you potentially, link up with users, with marginalized groups who would be users of the system, who would be beneficiaries, or, the opposite of the system, to just test the system for unintended and undesirable consequences. But there is also obviously the possibility that once these systems are in use, there's potentially going to be, legal action to be taken against any discrimination that might surround from, might arise from them. But I think the most important or the most difficult issue that, in my experience, that we have to resolve is a resource issue. Because ultimately, the development of these systems is resource intensive. The maintenance and the operation of these systems is resource intensive. And what often happens is that data protection issues then take a backseat, because the resource in the first instance is going to be used for establishing the systems in the first place, with the best of intentions generally. It's just that the best of intentions, as I said, don't always hold out for the long term. So I think what we need to do is really engage with grassroots organizations that actually have a good basis for representing marginalized communities, including people living in poverty and other marginalized communities.
Thank you very much. Selmani, from your sort of international policy perspective, would you like to weigh in on that? Where perhaps in the tech process could people with marginalised groups essentially best be involved? Is it only through data collection, or really us collecting more or better data from them? What do you think about that?
Yeah, thanks. I think it really cuts. My suggestion with this needs to cut across the entire sort of chain or process. I think the focus largely has been around inclusion in sort of data collection and probably design in the design phases, but I think increasingly, like as Judith has mentioned, and I think as the person who posed the question is suggesting, there are two other places that are really crucial. So, conducting periodic reviews or audits about what the impacts of models or data could be on communities as a whole. That's crucial. But I think also, secondly, we need to build in our data collection and management frameworks opportunities for feedback, ongoing feedback. And as we receive feedback, it's important to have vulnerable groups, marginalized communities included in there to again test to see where we're getting things wrong. I think broadly from the international policy space, it's really, I think, important to reflect on the fact that to a large extent we're sort of all learning as we go. This is new territory for everybody, for regulators, for policymakers, for companies, and even for us as societies. And just here in particular to call out, I think, an interesting process that's happening at the United Nations level, which is the Global Digital Compact. Essentially a framework how we could chart the use of digital commons and data in achieving the sustainable development goals. And this is an initiative that's been led by Rwanda and Sweden, but also under the aegis of the Secretary General's technology envoy. And so essentially, I think when many of these conversations started, 15 years ago, the world has dramatically shifted. And so also how we think about inclusivity, both inclusivity in terms of including everyone in the world, but also inclusivity with respect to underserved communities, marginalized groups, and vulnerable groups. We have to sort of reshape how we look at data in particular, not only as a resource, but as a mechanism that can exacerbate inequality. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm wondering if Dr. Moye would like to bring his experience with marginalized groups to bear and talk to us about, perhaps respond to Dr. Kinyanyu.
Yeah, I just wanted to underline two issues. So the first one relates to inclusion, and at what stage. I think that the inclusion should start at the program design stage. So whether they're developing technologies, new technologies, to what extent do they respond to the needs of the marginalized groups? And I think at that stage, most of the exclusion happens because for tech companies, that may require additional resources being used without necessarily broadening the scope of the market. So they look at it specifically from a business sense. Does it make sense to produce gadgets, for example, that have additional items, yet the market that is going to demand that is not so broad. So I think issues can emerge there. Then the second one, I think, is and I go back to the point of overrepresentation. I think that there is a tendency when we talk about inclusion to overgeneralize. So if we say, for example, persons with disabilities, that's a very broad term that includes children, refugees, older persons, women, girls, and all that. So I think that even within those subcategories, there are groups that are usually overrepresented and groups that are not even thought about. Do we even think about, for example, persons with intellectual disabilities? Perhaps not often than we should. So there are minorities, I think, within minorities that do not find expression at every stage, whether it's policy making, whether it's actually the development of these technologies, even the remodeling through generative AI. It revolves around the standard person, not the other. So there are issues there. Let me stop there for a while.
Oh, actually, Dr. Moye, while we have you, we have a question from Jacqueline Okello. So how, for example, could we better include communities like the sign language community, especially in terms of technologies that they perhaps can't access as easily?
Sorry, the question again?
How would we include communities like, for example, the sort of, I guess, the deaf community who use sign language to communicate? How would we better include them in the sort of digital sphere, essentially, when they can perhaps not access the technologies as easily?
Yeah, that's a difficult one for me, especially with sign language issues. I haven't quite really delved into that, so I don't want to make a wrong attempt. Perhaps somebody from the panelists may want to attempt that.
Can I just come in?
Certainly, yes.
Yes. My view may not directly link with the deaf community, but the idea of involvement, I see it from participation, not just provide data, but to define problems and solutions. As we collect data, what exactly do we want to use it for? And what are the issues? So in my view, a sort of community engagement whereby we collect data, but that should produce results. So it's not just data collection per se, it's data collection for action. And what is the action? And those marginalized should define their own actions and what they would like to see happen in terms of improving their lives. I think that's the approach which I would prefer we take. That data collected, but for what is the focus? What do you want to deal with? What do you want to use the data for? If we use that approach, doesn't become just a process of data collection, but for action. Thank you.
Thank you. And that's a very, very good point. Another question from the audience that I will just put in there before going back to our predefined questions. From Pavan Selvanathan, I'm very sorry if I mispronounced that. But does the panel think? This is an extra human right. This isn't in the list in the UN Convention. But actually, I kind of do wonder whether it perhaps should be added. What does the panel think or perhaps define as being the human right to data? Judith, perhaps you could begin on that one. Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, that's fine. I think there is indeed a human right to data protection, not to data itself, in the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. So that is one of the most recent human rights instruments that was adopted or came into force in 2010. So we are going there, and I know that there are decisions afoot to push for a global right to data protection, but I'm quite intrigued by the idea of, the human right to data, because that seems more about, what I as an individual am allowed to do with data. What should my level of control be over my own personal data? So I think for me, this is interesting because the way in which existing human rights systems have defined the right to privacy and the right to data protection is always very individual focused. It's very much to give the individual more or less the power to decide what can be done with their data. And this is also what the majority of data protection frameworks aim for, that, the individual is essentially put in a position where they have sovereignty over their data. And I think that is, a good approach on the one hand, but I also think it has, it has shown some issues, because as soon as you hand over the right to anything entirely to an individual, then that individual is also in a position to trade that good for something else. And I think what we have seen in terms of existing power relationships, particularly in the online environment, is that a lot of people, even particularly in the global north, actually have started to trade their data in for convenience, for access, for all sorts of information. And this affects them individually because now the data is out there and is being used often to their detriment, but it also affects communities. So if I trade in my DNA data so that I can find out whether or not I have maybe a heritable disease or something like that. This is an individual decision, but I also hand over this data to a company. And if that company does the same with a million other people, they will potentially show correlations, which is all that they want to do. But if they then sell that data to health insurance companies, then my individual decision to hand over my data for my own convenience contributes to potential discrimination of an entire group of people that might no longer be able to obtain health insurance. So I think when we talk about the human right to data, we have to be very aware that this does not or should not mean that we have an absolute right to do with our data what we want without having some sort of, I don't know how to really say this, but, some sort of awareness that this has a community impact potentially. And particularly with regard to marginalized communities, this can be very, very impactful in the future. So a human right to data should probably not be an absolute right as such. It needs to be balanced against other community rights, I think.
That's a really interesting perspective. So we don't operate in a vacuum, and what we do does have impact on others and also on the data sets and how they're perhaps interpreted.
Can I add something here?
Absolutely, go ahead.
Yes, this is an interesting question, because I think we often think about it from data from the perspective of the data subject. I would say that the right to data is actually recognized in many international human rights instruments, but mainly through the right to access to information. So you have a right, for example, in terms of the African regional instruments. I think also the ICCPR has a right of access to information. And the right to education, I think essentially is also about the right to information. And to sort of balance this with what Judith was talking about, I think the question that arises is which data. So you have a right to data, but if it is ethically published data, so no one has a right to really know about my data as an individual. If that data has not been, for example, ethically and procedurally obtained and then published in some kind of document to which the public has access. I think with regards to personal data, it's a very difficult argument to make, to say that I have a right of access to information, therefore you should give me information regarding yourself and how you live and how you conduct yourself. You can only get that data if it is published somewhere and all other rules have been observed. I think that right is not very, very limited, but it's very limited, as Judith says, if it's personal data and it's not published and I have not consented to its publication or processing, then we have the usual privacy issues emerging. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So there's a lot of conversation going on in the chat box. So kind of for our audience, if you would like to get involved in that, then please do open the chat box. It's at the bottom of your screen and have a look at what's going on there. A lot of information and questions, but for now I'm going to move on to our next question because we've kind of almost got there in the discussion anyway. So what can researchers and data professionals do concretely to respect the rights of test subjects or those whose data they're collecting? Could we perhaps go to Professor Kwandai for this one?
Thank you. Probably I might want to start by indicating that one way to look at data, what I have found useful as a guide is to use what we call the human rights approach to data management, the whole process as we look at it. But most importantly, I'm more convinced about privacy of the data once it is made available. I'm more concerned about accountability. I'm more concerned and interested in the issues of integrity and confidentiality when it comes to data, so that whoever has got the data should be able to be aware of what are the rights of the people whose data we have. I think that is how I would look at it, the whole essence of the human rights approach to data as it was enshrined by the UN, that we should look at a whole set of data. Either we are collecting, we are keeping it, we are protecting it, we should look at that whole set. I find it more useful because it's holistic and helps to deal with all the other issues which deal with the data. I'll leave it there for my other colleagues who might want to make a contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So how can we, or researchers, data professionals, what can we concretely do to respect the rights of test subjects or those whose data we are collecting? Could we please hear from Dr. Kinyon Yu on that one?
Thanks. I think, crucial here is around, the idea of consent. Do we really take the time to explain what consent is? Is this well understood? Is it appreciated? But then also, do we build in the sort of safeguards that can allow individuals ethically to withdraw that data from the testing that's been done, for example, or from the analysis? I think it really requires us to have sort of a different approach to how we engage in data processing and analysis, to be more open to some expectations or demands that may exist in today's world. And then I think also really important in the age of increased cyber threats is making sure we store and manage this data with great responsibility. A lot of times the data that's provided for research or for analysis is extremely private in nature. Many times it's collected on the basis that it will be anonymized. And so are we building in the sort of safeguards to ensure that this data cannot be compromised, it cannot be attacked? And I think we may probably see, an interesting trend of, research institutions, think tanks, and large data processors being targeted by unscrupulous cyber actors, because there's actually a wealth of, very interesting data around people's perceptions, attitudes, etc., that could be, extremely commercially valuable. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So, Judith, I don't know whether you'd like to weigh in on what can data professionals, what can researchers do concretely to protect the rights of those whose data they're collecting?
I have to agree with Selemani. I think one of the most important things is, either to obtain consent or to make sure that you do process data. I mean, in Europe, we have quite complex legal frameworks around this. So, there are a number of legal grounds on which you can collect and process data for research purposes. But the problem is that actually it gives a lot of leeway to researchers. So I think, the legal framework is there, but it is supposed to support researchers in being able to research. So I think from an ethical perspective, it is absolutely adamant that there is full transparency. I think that is one of the most important things, particularly in terms of medical research. I would say that, data subjects know at the very least what is being done with their data. Data security, I think, is another one, mostly because the idea of anonymization has really gone out with the dinosaurs, I think, in that, any form of anonymization technology that we apply today is likely to be unapplied by technological development in the future. And I think that is just a fact of life that we start to have to deal with it. So I think a lot of technologists are already like, anonymization of data is not going to save you from hackers and things. So you probably have to deal even with anonymized data as if it would be unanonymized or de-anonymized in the future. So the security measures are very, very important. And also it's a question, I think, of training. Because I think among the research community for a very long time, there was this idea that if the data is already there, we can use it. And I think that is probably a very unethical approach, because when people part with their data, when they share their data with a particular institution or a company, for a particular purpose, they do not expect that that data is then going to be accessed for other purposes. And in some cases, maybe they don't want that. In some cases, maybe they shouldn't have a right to say no, but transparency, I think, is absolutely imperative. So I would say transparency, and to make sure that the institution itself, the researchers themselves, are very aware, what regulations they have to comply with, and also what actually is the ethical way of using data, and also be aware that the data relates to people. It is not just a resource that they can use however they see fit.
Mm-hmm. There's a comment here that's been left in the chat by Gideon, that independent research ethics committees or IRBs should perhaps review any research activity collecting or using data. Perhaps that might be a solution to it. So I'm going to move on just in the interests of trying to finish at or around 11:30 as we had planned. So the next question is, with the recent interest in AI in the media, what do you see as the main issues, and how do you think that this might impact human rights? Selimani, with your sort of tech and policy background, you might be the best one to kick off this discussion.
Thanks. I think just to preface this by saying, we've been using AI for a really long time. I think what's sort of been different this time around over the last, 6 to 9 months has been the deployment of, large language models. And we're really seeing sort of an inflection point with respect to how increasingly integrated artificial intelligence is becoming in our lives. And I think this holds both great promise and peril. We're seeing a lot of very interesting use cases, a lot of very beneficial use cases for artificial intelligence. But increasingly, many people are sort of sounding out some of the potential harm or risks that may emerge from the use of artificial intelligence. Many leaders in the sector, talk both about the existential risks that artificial intelligence may pose, but I think there are also some that are sort of more short and medium term, closer to home. I think, again, going back to sort of the issue around inclusivity. How are these models being built? How inclusive are they? What data sets are they based out of? And how inclusive generally as a whole are these technologies accessible to, the large populations across the world, and in particular in Africa. So I think that's something we have to continually remind ourselves of, even as sort of the AI race continues to accelerate off. The second issue, I think, is around regulation and as is with many technologies, the technology starts and then regulation follows. And I think, again, there needs to be a very delicate balance between the absolute need for regulation, but also, on the other hand, making sure we do not stifle innovation. And I know this will be a very difficult thing to do as we go forward, but I think that's, again, really, really necessary to think about as we head on. The third question is, I think, around what I call the power. Right? So a lot of these tools, designs, resources are now being developed by companies, and companies increasingly playing a much larger, more powerful role in our geopolitics. And I think thinking about how companies can be responsible, how they can act in a manner that enhances ethics and safety, not just with artificial intelligence, but how these technologies are integrated into our lives will be really, really crucial. So specifically when it comes to the use of data, it's easier to expect governments or business, nonprofits, for example, to act in a transparent way, but it's something separately different when, these are, private corporations. What sort of guidelines, what sort of standards do we expect these corporations to live by? Will this be driven by self-regulation by the corporations themselves, or will this be driven by international regulation or even national regulation? I just saw earlier this week we have the EU AI Act. Again, if this will take on similar life as did GDPR, what will that mean for companies and the manner in which they use our data, and particularly in the context of artificial intelligence? But I think also finally, there's this lens around how, big data and artificial intelligence coming together are influencing our culture. I think that's an aspect that we don't often talk about. But if it's driving trends around, let's say, pulling up algorithms or on our news feeds on things that may be more contentious, more divisive, what is that doing to our culture, to our society, to our values? What is that doing for children, for example, who are being born into a space where they're extremely connected? And I think those questions need to probably one final point is around intellectual property and the data and artificial intelligence. We are seeing the increase in synthetic forms of productions, music, poems, art, etc., that are based on the use of people's individual data or ideas that are then sort of synthesized by these artificial intelligence algorithms. And so, who owns that data? What is the split or share? I think again are other questions we may need to think of. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So, the questions of intellectual property, certainly, that is a big issue, and it's kind of what a lot of people are talking about at the moment. How does it affect our rights? How does it affect our rights in that space? Judith, would you perhaps like to weigh in and tell us what you think about the main issues of AI and how AI may impact or is already impacting on human rights?
Yeah, I think what AI has sort of brought into sharp relief is something that we've probably known, in the data protection area for a while, and that is that one of the problems with the approaches to the use of data that we've had is we have actually generally assumed that data should always be usable. And I think sort of more and more, there has been more and more people who've basically said that we have to take some things off the table because even data protection frameworks do not actually take things off the table. There is no blacklist of stuff that you are not allowed to do with data. And I think for a long time that was sort of okay because data processing itself was highly regulated in many countries. I think what AI seems to suggest is that there is more of a parallel to, other areas that actually do take certain uses off the table, like, toxic waste or nuclear power or, weapons, or, there are certain areas where we as humanity have sat down and said, actually, that is okay, but that is not okay. We should not be doing this. And there are international agreements for not doing stuff and so on and so on. And I think with regard to AI, the discussion is now, well, I'm not saying the discussion, but I think the idea is now that some of these things that are coming on, there are such big warnings from experts, of what impact this could have on our societies, on our cultures, as Philomania said, in terms of power shifts in society, abuse of political power, creation of political power, by companies included, companies that become so big that they are essentially become political players. That I think when we're looking at the EU AI Act, that is maybe one of the first steps where this idea of taking things off the table has come to the fore, because it actually does include albeit very small list of, prohibited uses of AI. Now, there are a lot of people in the NGO section from civil society who say that list is way too short. There is another list that is called high-risk activities, which is subject to heavy regulation. And then there is everything else. And I think the discussion that we're going to be engaged in with the large language models and with all the, the new developments in technology, the discussion we're going to have over the next few years is about these three lists. What is activity that should be absolutely prohibited? What is activity that is high risk and needs to be strictly regulated? And what is stuff that we do not really need to worry? And that might shift, these lists might shift. So I think it's difficult to really say something about this right now because we are at the very beginning of this process. But I think the big mindset shift that I can observe is that we are thinking about it. Society as societies, what kind of AI uses do we think should not be permitted because the dangers and the risks of them are just too big?
Just in your view, what do you think that the main use are that really should be prohibited?
That's terrible. I think my main concern, and I was very interested to hear Soleimani talk about, the power issue, as he calls it. When I teach my students, I actually call it the power triangle. I think in every society, we have a power triangle between business, government, and individuals. And individuals participate in this power triangle with two hats on, one as a consumer with regard to business and one as a citizen with regard to the state. And, the idea of law essentially is to keep that triangle in balance. Whenever there is a shift in one direction and the triangle goes a little bit out of shape, the law is trying to step in and refocus that triangle. And I think the uses of AI that I am particularly concerned about are the ones that create infrastructure that shift that power in a way that law can no longer rebalance it. Because a lot of the time law goes behind the technology. Technology is developed first, we give it a bit of time to play out, then the law comes in and says, let's adjust this. And this is what I mean by adjusting the triangle. But there is now stuff, and I think we've seen this with big data already, where infrastructures have been created that then allow companies, but also governments, to argue that this can now not be regulated anymore because if you do, you destroy the entire infrastructure. We've seen this with regard to online tracking of behavior. There is an awful lot of stuff. And I think I'm just worried with regard to AI systems that they are built in a way that they become so much fabric of the infrastructure that carries society that their regulation will become impossible. So it's difficult for me to give you a complete, example for this, but I think this is where we have to look at in various areas. Bit of a cop-out, I know, but sorry.
No, not really, because it is the most important area, is protecting people and protecting human rights, really. A comment in the chat pointing out that perhaps we should be turning the focus round. So Gideon gives the example of car manufacturers having to prove that cars are safe, and perhaps users of data, including AI, should really have to do the same, which is definitely an interesting perspective. Thank you very much. So on to our final question. Oh, and also saying that, Dr. Rauhofer, your point about infrastructure is excellent and well illustrated in healthcare. So on to the final question, in the interests of finishing more or less on time. With the increase in data-intensive research and focus on data law and ethics in general, do we now think that it's perhaps time that data ethics should become an integral part of the education curriculum in schools and universities? And if so, why? And I would like to start with Dr. Kwandai for this first question, please.
Thank you very much. First of all, we need to look at the concept of curriculum, all the learning experiences which take place in the school, outside the school. And again, there are factors which bring about that. So I want to contextualize that argument, whereby what determines curriculum: sociological, societal issues, psychological, philosophical, science and technology, government policies, what is happening. So if we look at data ethics, if we look at data law, these things are already happening in our society. You see that we now talk about data everywhere. We also have a lot of issues to do with data, like datafication, whereby everything now is transformed into data. We now talk about the digital natives. In fact, surrounding us, there's a lot of data. So looking at the factors, sociological, we agree that data issues are now part of us and therefore determines curriculum. If we look at philosophy, which determines what should be learned by schools, by universities, we look at the various philosophies which say, for example, that those things which are useful in life should be taught in our schools, in our universities as part of curriculum. So the issue of data literacy, etc., they are now part of us and therefore they are useful and should be in the curriculum. In fact, we need what we call lifelong education, professional development. We can no longer do without data, which is part of our life, and therefore should be in our schools, should our universities. In fact, the question could be, why is it that those that are not teaching data ethics and like, why are they behind? Because if we do research online, over 250 colleges, universities are already teaching data ethics, the issues to do with the data law, meaning that already has started. And the issue now is those that have not started. So the question is very clear. Data ethics, data law should be taught to our students to support ethical approaches, to support what we call data value chain, data collection, analysis, etc. for everybody, every village now, developed countries, developing countries. We always talk about phones, which are now banks, which is about data. So the reasons for including data ethics, data law are overwhelming, which could take another lecture today. So I'm just saying it is now a must. We are ready, those that will not have started, because it's so useful. Students have to know how to protect themselves through the data law. They have to understand data protection. What does it mean for them when they become adults, when they become employees of companies? So overall, I'm trying to support the argument because curriculum theory is supportive of that. The practice around us is supporting that. So therefore, data ethics is now a must. It's no longer an option. Thank you.
Thank you. In fact, a colleague of mine, I'm not going to take credit for this metaphor myself, talks about how doctors have to learn about medical ethics when they are training. And he posited that, in fact, this is really why data professionals should be learning about ethics, so that they're aware of the risks, so that they're aware of their responsibilities in this space. Is there anybody else that would like to weigh in on this final question? Time for data ethics to become an integral part of the education curriculum, and why?
Yeah, let me hazard an answer there. I wanted to say I think it's already part of the curriculum, but in very different ways, and it's sort of fragmented, I think. So you were talking about forensic medicine, for example, in medical schools. We have, I think, across many law schools in the world, we have what is called legal ethics. But the focus there is really on what happens in the practice of the law instead of other ethical issues. Then universities, I do understand, have anti-plagiarism software such as 1018 and all that. So I think there are bits and pieces across the board, and it's a matter of consolidating what is there to make one major intervention that incorporates also issues relating to artificial intelligence. Here at our law school, we already have some kind of document trying to guide us on how to handle ChatGPT, because the students are using it a lot, and of course without acknowledging that they have used it. So just to say that I think it's in a way already part of the curriculum, but it should come front and center, which is not the case at the moment. So how you do that in primary schools, I think it could be a challenge among children, but at universities it should be relatively easy, because you're talking about adults who understand issues better. With the schools, I think it's just maybe having to bind management and teachers and school administrations, but not necessarily try to teach it to kids. I think it's too early for them to understand that. That's what I would say. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moyo. Would anybody else like to weigh in on this final question? Salmani, please.
Yeah, thanks. I think the primary reason for me is around trust and accountability. I think we're living in extremely interesting times, both of an overabundance of information or data, but also at a time where it's very difficult to be sure about the quality of the information and the data that we're receiving. What we witnessed in the COVID pandemic, I think is a good example of where misinformation, disinformation that was generated by the scientific and academic community on both sides of the divide is an important reason why we need to center this conversation around data ethics. But then also I think researchers and universities in particular are probably at the front line of being data stewards. They shape government policy responses on a broad range of issues. And I think the more we rely on data and the more we rely on the use of data, the more we need to make sure we center data ethics conversations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And of course, trust and accountability are very important, because without that, it is difficult to collect that data, necessarily build up the picture that we need in order to make good decisions. Judith, do you have anything to add to this final question?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to, this is potentially a global north perspective, but I think, or a lawyer's perspective, however you want to say, I think I sometimes have a little bit of a conflicted relationship with the term data ethics, because I'm a data protection lawyer, and there is always this, relationship between what is law and what is ethics. I think in a society or in a country where there is yet no legal framework to protect data ethics is often seen as a first step. It's like a voluntary compliance with certain principles, to not use data in a certain way, or to make sure you comply with certain ethical principles. In a country where there is already a strong data protection framework, data ethics become an add-on, an extra. And, this is what I can do, but, or what I am allowed to do, but is it still ethical? Are there still extra ideas that I need to bear in mind, even with, data processing activities that are actually permitted by the law? Where my concern comes from is that data ethics, or the ethics approach, particularly in the area of AI, has been captured by companies a lot as a replacement of law. And I think that is a concern that we have to be very aware of when we're talking about, do we want to teach data ethics? So I would say, yes, we want to teach data ethics, and ideally not at 8:00 on a Friday, which is what often happens in IT law courses. We do want to teach it, but I think we also want to make sure that we make it clear that it's not a replacement for a binding legal framework, because I think ultimately we're not going to deal with data uses that we're looking at going forward just by ethics. I think we have to make sure of its place in the entire spectrum of tools that are available.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all. So I'm going to kind of try and sum up really briefly what we talked about today. So we've acknowledged that, some of the biggest issues in human rights around data center around equality and issues of privacy, but also trust and accountability. We've raised concerns about economic exploitation and, again, equality and privacy. That seemed to crop up quite a lot in our discussion. In terms of AI, then we've talked about how the AI Act is perhaps not comprehensive enough, and this wonderful idea that Judith has talked about in how they're trying to manage that, looking at prohibited activity, which sounds like a really sort of logical place to start. We have also talked about issues of underrepresentation and discrimination, for example, in data collection, and concerns around minority groups, safeguarding and concealing of marginalised groups, but also, interestingly enough, overrepresentation that Judith has talked about that's been seen in studies, especially in the global north, and how that can actually skew the answers that we get from the data collection and can kind of skew that representation. So we've kind of largely agreed that, we need data-driven and evidence-based policy making, that this is something really important. So we do need to kind of build that trust and accountability. And also that while we've acknowledged that data ethics is already in university curriculums in one form or another, that there needs to be a sort of a more comprehensive basis of data ethics across any research courses. All that remains now is to say thank you so much, and thank you to our audience for being with us today. And thank you also to our panel, so Selemani Kinyonyu, Judith Rauhofer, Admak Moyo and Hudson Kwandai. Thank you all so much for being with us today and sharing your ideas, and we will be in touch in the very near future. Thank you to everyone as well that helped behind the scenes organising and facilitating this event, especially Professor Juliet Thondlana from Nottingham University, Ransford Beoki and Agyemang Oikeri from the Association of African Universities, and Sushit Anand from the Ethical Data Initiative. I also need to drop into the chat, here we go, the feedback form that I promised you at the beginning of this event. So if all of our participants could please fill in that form so that we can get sort of ideas and feedback from you, then that would be excellent. We'll also be sending that out in an email with more information about how you can get involved afterwards. I'd also like to apologise to everybody whose questions we didn't use during the event, because there was sort of some excellent comments and questions going on in the chat there. We were inundated with questions, so thank you all for that. And as I say, we will be in touch soon with information about the next webinar in the series and about how you can get involved. Thank you all. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
You.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.